All right. So if everyone wants to grab a seat, I think we have a pretty good crowd, Joe. All right, our first speaker tonight is Stephen Gebhardt, who works in Old Lyme as a supervising fisheries biologist with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, aka DEEP, and studies, I can't pronounce this word.
Anadromous.
Thank you. Fish, like shad, that are born in freshwater, spend most of their lives in the sea, but then return to freshwater to spawn in the spring. He has held this position with DEEP since 1995. From 1986 to 1994, he served as the senior fisheries biologist for the department, working on various aspects of the
Anadromous?
the one that begins with D.
The what?
The one that begins with D.
Oh, diadromous.
Thank you. Fish program. Mr. Gebhardt was also an environmental editor at the Lawrence Erdang Inc. in Essex in 1978 and a fisheries biologist in the U.S. Peace Corps in Lesotho in 1976. That's a program in and of itself. Mr. Gebhardt received a BA from Aurora University and an MS from the University of Connecticut. And just a little side note, in 2014, President Barack Obama appointed him to be Commissioner of the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization. Kudos to you.
I don't know where you found that. I haven't heard anybody refer to the Lawrence Erdang gig in a long, long time.
You just Googled.
Yeah. I probably won't need this, but that's good. I was having trouble with the focus. Is that in focus?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It's my eyes.
Where is that on the river?
Oh,
Oh, come on.
oh. And who wants to tell her where this is? River?
I know it. I want
So that's the Salmon River. The Blue Oar and the marina's over there. And so the island, you can see Haddam Island right at the top of the river, right at the top of the slide.
I knew that. I just wanted to make sure they.
Thank you. You wanted to know if I knew it. Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm stalling because a few more people are walking in. So we will quiz you on those words. So there's anadromous, which refers to the fish like shad that start their life in freshwater, then they go out to sea. And they feed and they grow and they mature out there, and then they come back to the same freshwater to spawn themselves some years later. So that's anadromous. We have one species that is catadromous, starts its life in the ocean, comes into freshwater to feed, to grow, to mature, and then goes back out to the ocean to spawn.
Eels.
Very good. American eel. That's the only one. So you've got anadromous and catadromous, and I cover both, but that's too much of a mouthful, so then we have diadromous. That's the D word. The diadromous is a collective term for both of them. So with that, hi everyone, how you guys doing? Next slide, please. So this is the American shad. It is the largest of the anadromous herring, can get up to 9 pounds. More commonly much smaller, and it is the state fish of Connecticut. So it's laterally compressed and silvery, and the scientific name right there is most delicious, good to eat. This life cycle was actually put together for the river herring, which is the kissing cousins of the shad, and so you'll see some references, but the life cycle is really the same. This time of year, so everything down here is in saltwater, everything up here is in freshwater. This time of year, they're entering the streams to spawn. They distribute their eggs in the water. The fertilized eggs just drift in the water for a day or so before they hatch. And then they transition into these small, after the larvae, into these small little juvenile shad that then spend most of the summer in the river feeding. Meanwhile, the adults can survive spawning, and they all go back out to sea. And we'll see some of them the next year. But the little ones will stay in the river the rest of the season. It starts getting cold, often late September, October. You can stand, what I always used to like to do is stand on the East Haddam Bridge around dusk. Some September night, and you can see the silvery little fish popping at the surface as they're feeding and migrating down. Then they go into the ocean. They enter into this circular migration around North America. They end up down in Florida, and then they migrate along the coast and go up to the Bay of Fundy and then come back down. And they do this a couple, maybe 3 or 4 times before it's time for them to return to spawn, and then they complete the life cycle. They come back into our river. So they enter the rivers usually around the 1st of April when the water temperature reaches about 50 degrees. This year, everything is weird. This year it was just a strange, strange year. Normally they spawn throughout May and early June, and a lot of this other information I've already told you about, the little ones staying in. They can spawn multiple times. Interesting about shad. Shad, by the way, are found from Florida, the St. Johns River by Jacksonville, Florida, all the way up into Canada. From Cape Fear, North Carolina south, they all die after they spawn, like Pacific salmon. From Cape Fear north, they can survive in increasing percentages as you go north. So our repeat spawning rate used to be about a third, about 30%. It's going down now, but you go up into Canada, it's almost half of them can repeat spawn. So it's probably a function of water temperature. Now, for those of you that don't know, they find their way home the same way most anadromous fish find their way home, and that's through sense of smell. It's through imprinting. Every body of water has a unique chemical identity, and it's not an odor that you and I might smell, but it's a combination between a sense of taste and a sense of smell that fish can recognize. And it depends on what kind of soil the river is going through, what kind of bedrock. Perhaps, is it an oak forest? Is it a pine forest? Lots of different things, especially the organic compound, the components of it, create this unique chemical identity. And the young fish, when they're still in the river before going out, they can memorize that odor. We call it imprinting. They go out to sea, they spend 3 or 4 years out to sea, and when they're coming back into coastal waters, they sense the smell of the Connecticut River. They can distinguish the Connecticut River from the Delaware or the Hudson or the Merrimack, and they'll come back in to spawn. Next slide, please. So in terms of fisheries, we started fishing for shad fairly early in our history, although it really picked up after the Revolutionary War, because as long as there is salmon around, people tend to focus on netting the salmon and eating the salmon. In fact, early in our colonial history, shad eating was somewhat disreputable. It said that if you ate shad, you probably didn't have enough money to have pork. I won't get into this whole story. I don't have time, but shad eating became fashionable after the Revolutionary War because the shad, and particularly Connecticut River shad, played an important role in feeding the Continental Army. And after that, people, and of course by then the salmon were disappearing too, and so shad became more popular. The first fisheries were these big beach seines, and this famous painting here of the Delaware is the same thing that happened in the Connecticut. They have these big seines on a barge or on a boat, and then row this out, way out into the river, and then row it back. One end is held onto, is fastened at the shore, and then the other end, once they came ashore, they'd hook it up to oxen or horses or whatever, and then pull that in, and they could net thousands of shad at one time. After that came fixed gill netting, and this little crude sketch shows you how that works. This is the shoreline. Here's the water level. They would pile rocks out in the river, and then they would put a ring or a stake or something out there, and then once that's taken care of, they would spread their gill net across and tie it up to both ends. And so then, while that's fishing, the fish would come in and they would get netted in there, and then they'd row out and disconnect this, and then use this capstan, sometimes with animals or sometimes with, you know, a lot of strong arms, and then pull the net in. The interesting thing about this is that the Connecticut River is a sandy river, unlike the Penobscot or other rivers to the north. Most of the Connecticut River, I mean, other than some of the riverbanks, the stream bed itself is sand. But we've got these rock piles in the river, and if you ever do any boating in the mouth of the river, you're familiar with them. You may have ruined a few propellers, or hopefully not a lower unit on it. These rocks, and you can hit the next slide, these rocks are all fishing piers. They were all from that diagram that I just showed you. And a lot of them had names, the Dickinson, Gibraltar, usually the name of the fisherman or the fish company. And so, and these aren't just in the mouth of the river. Right up here in Haddam and Chester, East Haddam, we've got some of these remnants of the old fish rocks. There's another way of fishing for shad, and that was pound nets. And pound nets wouldn't catch just shad, they'd catch everything. And in this case, they'd drive stakes and trees into the river, and they would then circle it with a net, so it's sort of a closed-in area, like a room. And then they would have a funnel in there, like a lobster trap, and a net would come out and it'd intercept and guide the shad, so they'd hit that net, they'd swim in, they'd get inside these pound nets, and they couldn't get out. And so then the fishermen would come in and purse the net and pull out the fish, and there was a little bit of everything in it. Interestingly, the place a lot of pound nets were catching the salmon and shad in the Connecticut River were off here between Duck Island and Cornfield Point. You couldn't put them out here because they'd interfere with navigation. But there's also some indication that as these migratory fish were approaching the Connecticut River, the tides were going back and forth, they actually would stage over here. And so these nets over here were particularly effective at catching a lot of fish. But at some point right at the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, most of these ways of netting fish were outlawed. They were either too effective or they were non-discriminative, they'd catch everything. And so our predecessor agency outlawed all of these and only allowed drift gill netting, which is what we do today. The gill nets are stretched out into the stream, and you know, they're tied off at each ends with buoys, and then they're just allowed to float with the tide down the river. And then, depending on how long you soak the net, it may be in the river for a couple of hours, and it may travel several miles down the river. All of the time, the fish are striking this net, and the net mesh size is designed just to catch shad, so other fish could get caught in it, but the smaller ones go through and the larger ones bounce off, and so it's a fairly selective fishery, not entirely. But that's what's going on now, and that's what these gentlemen are going to tell you about. Next slide, please. So early on, when we first started building dams on the Connecticut River, they were above the range of shad, and they didn't affect the shad too much. And I'm talking about 1600s and 1700s, mostly on the tributaries. But then, and the dam that really became a problem later in history was the Enfield Dam. But to begin with, that dam didn't go all the way across the river. It was what we call a wing dam, and it just diverted water from the river into the canals for the Windsor Locks canals. And so far so good for the shad. But now by the middle of the 1800s, we started building a lot more dams, and we started building dams that went all the way across the river. And these started blocking shad from their run. And so the shad have less and less habitat available to them, and now their numbers are starting to go down. And I mentioned water pollution and maybe some overharvest at times, although with shad, in-river overharvest wasn't too much of a problem over the years. But water pollution, you know, the Connecticut River got pretty polluted for a while there. But I have to tell you, it is the dams. The pollution may have been adding insult to injury, but it was the dams that wiped out a lot of our fish and caused the shad run to decline. Next slide. So you may have seen some publicity. Our agency is now celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. We were founded as the Connecticut Fish Commission right after the Civil War, specifically to restore salmon and shad to the Connecticut River. We were one of the first agencies, what we call natural resource agency, like a Fish and Game or a DEP. We were one of the first in the world. The first was Vermont. But the Connecticut River states were banding together to try to bring fish back to the Connecticut River. The federal government still didn't have a natural resource agency. There was no such thing as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at that time. In fact, they modeled the U.S. Fish Commission after our state commission. So Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut formed their commissions within the first couple of years, and it was to bring back the fish, and this is what they tried to do. They tried to build fishways at the barrier dams. They tried to clean up pollution. They were restricting harvest, like I mentioned, some of those netting techniques were outlawed, and we started raising shad in hatcheries. One of the main problems the restoration failed was the fishways were ineffective, and this was mostly a problem in Massachusetts. And the people in Connecticut complained vociferously that the Massachusetts fishways were not effective. This is a picture of one of the old primitive fishways up near the present-day site of Turner's Falls. And, you know, it was a log crib thing, and you know, some of the salmon might have gotten through it if they could find it, but it was very poor for shad. The problem with a lot of these is they were put in the wrong place. These old dams were providing water to mills, and the mill was on the other side of the river, and they were releasing the water over there, but because there was room over here, they built the fishway on this side. You know, but the fish are going to where the water is. So, I mean, looking back, we really see what mistakes were made, but it wasn't obvious that there was no such thing as fish passage specialists, as we are called now. The next slide will also show one of the problems. In addition to building fishways, we built shad hatcheries. The idea was that we had lots of pollution, we had lots of dams. They were preventing shad from spawning, so we were going to spawn shad in hatcheries. And the main hatchery, the first hatchery, and by the way, we were pioneers in this. We hired a guy named Seth Green from East Longmeadow, and he was a famous pioneer fish culturist, and we, the state of Connecticut, hired him to run our hatcheries, and one of the first ones was up near the Bradley Airport on the Farmington River, but that river got so polluted because of the woolen mills, they moved it down to the Salmon River in Leesville, and so this is Haddam, and this is East Haddam, and this is the old powerhouse that was built to generate electricity for the swing bridge. And this is the hatchery right there. So this went through a number of name changes, but after they consolidated a few times, this became Connecticut Light and Power. This was the first power generation of Connecticut Light and Power. The hurricane of '38 wiped out that powerhouse and reached the dam and destroyed the hatchery. And that was the beginning of the end of shad hatching. But what they did when they would hatch these fry, they would release some of the fry in the Salmon River, and that created a great run of shad in the Salmon River, and that's where we believe sport angling for shad was invented, right there on the Salmon River below Leesville. But the rest of the fry were transported to these 3 state-owned ponds in Lyme. Lower Pond, Middle Pond, which is not shown on this map because it washed out, and Upper Pond. And they operated into the 1920s or so, and right up until the hurricane destroyed the hatchery, I think in '38, and then they were sold off, and now these are privately owned. So, a lot of the modern scientific knowledge we know about American shad, not just for the Connecticut River, but in the world, came from the Connecticut River Ecological Study. This study, which began in 1965, was launched because of concerns over the Connecticut Yankee Atomic Power Plant. The fear was that this power plant would be pumping hot water into the river, it would warm up the river, it would create a thermal barrier to migratory fish, such as shad. They wouldn't be able to get past it, and it would ruin the shad run. So, They hired a number of scientists, including the head researcher was a professor out of Yale, and they put together this ecological study, and lots and lots of papers have been published from that over the years. One of the things that they discovered, which is sort of an interesting thing, we learned a lot more about shad migration. They put radio tags inside the shad and would release them, and they did this down in Old Saybrook. And they'd net them down there, they would release them, and then they would follow in a chase boat with an antenna and earphones, and they would follow the shad up the river and map where they were going. And we learned one thing is that the shad like to stay in the channel. They migrate in the channel. No big surprise there. Except when you get to Haddam, some funny things happen. So they're following the channel, they cross the East Haddam Bridge, and then right here, they leave the channel. Right after they get past the East Haddam Bridge, they leave the channel. So something is going on right there. And then they come back to the channel. And they follow the channel. So these are called, a lot of the guys call it the Haddam Flats, and a lot of people fish nets there. But so what's going on is that the plume of the Salmon River comes down here, and of course it smells like the Salmon River. Remember imprinting? They want to stay in the Connecticut River. They've been imprinted in the Connecticut River. So if they stay there, they think, well, I'm going up the Salmon River. I don't want to do that. So they get out of that plume, cut the corner, and go back in. Interestingly enough, the other thing they found out is, so here's the atomic power plant right there, and there's the discharge canal. And so one of the concerns was it's right there where it narrows that you'd have this hot water, this wall of hot water that would block the fish. But what they discovered through this tagging is that because of the size of the plant, now remember, Connecticut Yankee was not a big power plant. It wasn't a millstone, it wasn't a, 3 Mile Island. I was thinking of the one over on the Hudson Indian, whatever, but anyway. The water, as the hot water came out, it stratified because the heat rises. It stratified and stayed on the top 4 feet of the river. But the river's 28 feet deep there. And so what you had is this top lens of hot water, and the fish, and the tagging studies prove this, just swam right under it and kept going. And in fact, the results of this study pretty much vindicated the power plant in terms of fish. Now, there may have been other problems, and of course there's issues of what do you do with the waste, and what do you do with ugly orange booms, and all those things. But that's not what this study was intended to look at.
I got a question.
Yes.
You mentioned about tagging the fish in 1965. Was that anything to do with Texas Instruments?
Yes.
They were the ones who came in and followed the fish.
Texas Instruments was subcontracting, you're right. And for those of you who remember back then, the study, if you go down to Essex, right there where I think it's the Corinthian Yacht Club is now, that was where the Connecticut Ecological Studies offices were. They were headquartered out of there, and they had a number of people, and Texas Instruments were leaders at that time in producing these radio tags. Now, and they're big clunky things, but now, of course, we've miniaturized, and lots of people make radio tags that you can put down in the stomach of fish, and they're pretty small, but back then, Texas Instruments were the leaders.
Also, on that, when you say they raised the temperature, they couldn't go over 8 degrees.
You're right.
And it didn't affect the fish or the habitat.
That's right. The license, they got a license to operate the power plant, and the license had conditions, and it said you couldn't raise the water level more than that. Now, in the canal, it was pretty warm. If you went up there, it was pretty warm. But once it got into the river, and again, dilution. You're right, because if that was a huge power plant, things would have been different. But it worked out okay. Next slide, please. So anyway, the shad migration, hit it again, please. They came in, they milled around, they got to Essex, and the tagging study showed that they stopped. What's going on here? So let's blow up Essex. So here's the village of Essex right there, and South Cove, North Cove. What happened is they came in and they did this. The tagging study showed that they did this for about 48 hours. They were doing this, and then they shoot up. Any ideas?
They stopped at the bridge.
Yeah, when they still had John Courage on tap. No, it was, they're adapting to fresh water. They're coming into the river as a saltwater fish. And their kidneys, particularly their kidneys, but their other organs, are operating as a saltwater fish. See, anadromous fish are unique. If you take a sunfish from some pond in Haddam and throw it in Long Island Sound, it'll swim away. But it'll be dead in about 10 minutes because of osmoregulatory shock. Write that one down, that's a good one. If you take a shark out of Long Island Sound and put it in that pond in Haddam, it'll swim away. But it'll die in 10 minutes because of the opposite osmoregulatory shock. But anadromous fish can adapt to both, but they've got to go through the process. That's what they're going through the process. It's adapting, it's waiting for its skin, its kidneys, and even its tongue to adapt and switch over. And there's all sorts of interesting stories about that I can tell you. And then there are freshwater fish and they're off to the races.
Would you speak of the transition of brackish water?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that because I forgot to mention that. I took that for granted. But right there at Essex is where the salt wedge is. That's where the salt water meets the fresh water. And, you know, for most of the time in the spring, for example, if you go to that navigational aid just outside of Hamburg Cove, you can see barnacles on that, but you'll never see them farther north. So that's where the fresh meets the salt. Thank you. So anyway, if you hit that again, this is the overview of the migration. They come up, they pause in Essex, then they keep on going, and they go up into the spawning grounds, and the spawning areas start in Glastonbury and extend farther north. This is a map of the shad runs in Connecticut. The Connecticut River is the only river in Connecticut that has a strong, viable, self-sustained, well, I shouldn't say self-sustained, but a strong, viable, large, significant shad run. We do have shad that enter the Housatonic River and Naugatuck River. It's pretty small. In the Quinnipiac, we're dozens. We're not sure about the Hammonasset. There's no dams there. And we're usually less than 1,000 in the Shetucket River these days. So the orange is where they are. The pink is where they're extending to because of fish waste. So we're in the process of restoring these runs back up into the pink. So the next attempt to restore shad came in the 1960s when federal legislation was passed to provide states funding to do cooperative programs for fish restoration. So after a few years, the Connecticut River Atlantic Salmon Commission was created, but it's sort of a misnomer. Everyone thinks it was all about salmon. Shad were always a target for restoration, and in fact, these days, and now that we've transitioned out of the salmon restoration program, we're still working on shad, river herring, even eels, even sea lampreys. We're restoring a bunch of fish, but shad remain the primary target. And what we really need to do is build fish ways, because unlike the Housatonic and the Shetucket and some of these other streams over there that hardly have any shad left in them, the Connecticut River already had shad. There was no sense in building hatcheries and stocking shad in there. What we needed to do is reunite the shad with all that good upstream habitat that they have been denied. So this is a little obscure. I don't know if you can appreciate this, but I wanted to try to give you a sense of the difference between the Connecticut River and so many other rivers. So this is what we call a river profile, elevation. So we all know that at the headwaters of a river, they're up in the mountains, right? So this is the Connecticut River, and the headwaters are up in the White Mountains and Green Mountains, Vermont and New Hampshire. And it loses elevation. It comes down, it gets into Massachusetts, it's a little flatter, and then it gets into Connecticut, and it's tidal. And I've done the same thing for the Housatonic and the Shetucket River, different scales, because this is 410 miles long, and these are 90 miles long or something like that. But you can see it's the same shape, the same feature, high in the headwaters, and then come down. But the dashed line shows a unique feature of the Connecticut River, and that's the long tidal aspect. Excuse me. So on the Thames River, the tide only comes up to Norwich. And then you start getting rapids and falls. On the Housatonic River, the tide only comes up to Derby, and it's the same thing, just a few miles in. But on the Connecticut River, the tide goes all the way past Hartford, and that's, of course, the source of the name, right? Long tidal river. That's unique, because now let's look at fish habitat So this is where the salmon used to spawn, way up in the headwaters. And then this is where the shad used to spawn in the middle areas. And that's where they've got to go to lay their eggs. But now look at that, the tidal area. So what you find, and I've exaggerated it just so you can see it, on the Shetucket, the shad run is just a little bit below the head of tide, the habitat, and so is the habitat on the Housatonic. But look at the shad habitat in the Connecticut River. It's more extensive and a lot more below the head of tide. So what you see is we start building dams in the 1800s, and immediately the salmon will get wiped out, right? Because they've got to go way up there. One dam will wipe them out. But you can't build a dam in tidewater. It just doesn't work. And so you build a dam right at the head of tide. So you build a dam at the head of tide, and there's very little shad habitat left. Very little shad habitat. But up here, look at this. And in fact, the first dam that really was a problem was way up in Holyoke. My point is, this is why the Connecticut River still has, always has, and still has a viable shad run. Because we never totally denied them from all their habitat. There was always some habitat for them to come back to. And this map just shows a summary of the fishways that we've built to help shad. Now, these down here are on tributaries. The 8 Mile River, the Salmon River, the Farmington River, the Westfield River. But then these are the main stem dams that were built to allow shad and salmon getting up. And so shad used to get as far up as Bellows Falls, and then the big waterfall at Bellows Falls, Vermont, stopped them. It didn't stop salmon, and they kept going, and so we built some fishways for salmon up there. But here, we've got fishways, and so right now, shad are able to get back to the historical extent of their main stem habitat. Yes? So, the first dam, the Holyoke Dam, obviously, at over 30 feet high, nothing's getting over that. That's a picture in the summer. This is a picture in the spring when lots of water is coming over it. And we have probably the most famous fish elevators in the world operate at the Holyoke Dam. So this is in the tail race. This is the powerhouse, and there's a tail race over here, and the fish just swim up here, go through here, and you can see a couple of elevator shafts there. When they lift the elevator, that's what they get. They get a bucket full of hundreds and hundreds of shad. So here's a side view of the same thing. This is that powerhouse that you were just looking at. This is that elevator shaft. Here's another one. And here's the dam that extends off to the right of the picture. So what happens is the fish come looking for a place, and they finally find the water coming out of the entrance. Once they find the entrance, they go in, and then they follow the water back to the base of the elevator shaft. They get lifted. Now a computer does most of the work, but we can override it if we see a lot of fish down there. The hopper goes up, and then it dumps all the fish in the water into the flume, and once they're in this water-filled flume, they just swim right on out and go upstream on their way to spawn. And there's a window there in which we can count the fish. So not only do we live fish there, but we kidnap shad there as well. We pass over maybe 400,000 shad at Holyoke, so there's plenty of them. And every year, my staff will kidnap maybe 100, no, it's more than that, maybe 1,000 of those, and we bring them back to Connecticut and put them in some of those other rivers that I was telling you about, the Naugatuck River, the Shetucket River, to help restore those runs. Of course, we get them before they spawn, so we put them in there. And so what happens is they come through here again, they come through the fishway, they get lifted, then instead of taking them up to the top floor, which is freedom, we take them to floor number 1, which is this holding tank. This picture was taken, there's no water in it, but the fish in the water shoot down the chute and go into this holding tank, and the other fish will then go up to the top floor and get released, and they'll go past that window where they'll get counted and go on up to freedom. But the ones that we capture, we back up our Connecticut State truck, and we release the water through this hose into the tank, and we take all these fish in water, and we drive down to a Connecticut site, and we get ready, we're unrolling this plastic tube here, and we open it up, and all the water and the fish come out of that tank, come down this tube, and go into their new river. And that's home, and that's where they're going to spawn. Farther up the river, we have all these this is a $15 million fishway at Turner's Falls. And there's more fishways up I'm not going to go into, but just to let you know, there's still a lot of investment upriver from Holyoke to restore shad. And even in Connecticut, we have the largest fishway in Connecticut at the Rainbow Dam in Windsor on the Farmington River. And so there's the dam over there, there's the powerhouse, there's the tailways. This is the fishway right here. And it goes all the way along. That, by the way, is opened this Saturday, open house this Saturday from 10 to 3:30 to come in. It's 410 Rainbow Road, Windsor, Connecticut, if you can remember that. But it's a great family event. A lot of families will be in there, and they can go downstairs and look at the window and see the fish migrating past the downstream viewing. That's the fishway. All right, so how have we been doing? Where are we at with the restoration? This shows the numbers. We started out way back when, in the 70s, the numbers were pretty low, and we started building those fishways that I've been showing you. And the numbers were building up and up and up and up. And we were doing pretty good. We were passing over 700,000 shad over Holyoke. And by the way, this is just the numbers lifted at Holyoke. This is not a population census of what's in the river, because not all the shad go up to Holyoke and go over the dam. A lot of them are spawning down below and going into the tributary. So, I mean, we had close to 2 million shad in the river. Then we had this rapid decline, which we saw with most species in the Connecticut River. And it sort of oscillated around for many, many years, and we were trying to figure out what to do. And then later on, it starts rebounding. And so we've had 5 good years in a row where it's been building back up. And sort of too early to say. I mean, I'd be interested in listening to the netters and what they have to say. I think that, you know, we're now up to 200,000 passed over Holyoke. We should be doing better, but it's been a cold year. And we need a couple more weeks to know where we're going to put this bar for 2016. But hopefully, so right now we're about here. Hopefully we're going to be up here by the time it's over, but it's too early to tell. So yes.
Do you still, was it you guys who were tagging the shad? And do they still tag shad?
We're not tagging right now. We would like to, and the reason we are tagging them, just to let everybody know, we try to get a population estimate. We can count the number of shad at Holyoke, but it's really tough to estimate how many shad are not at Holyoke. And so we would tag it, we'd know how many we tagged, and we'd release them, and there's a formula. It's called mark and recapture. It's a technique fish biologists use all the time. Then we count not only the shad that passed, but the number of tagged shad that passed, and we can plug those into a formula, and we can come up with a population estimate. We'd like to be doing it, but you may have noticed we've got some budget problems in the state of Tennessee. Well, that's what I've got. Just a couple of closing shots of shad underwater and shad going through a fishway. And if you haven't had shad yet this year, go out and buy shad. I mean, this is the Essex shad bait, but I don't wait for the shad bait. I go out and buy my own and grill it. If you're a fish lover, if you haven't tried Connecticut River shad, you really owe it to yourself to do it. And it's guilt-free. Guilt-free eating, as I had explained in my radio program. The shad fishery is well managed. Sadly, there's just not that many netters anymore. They're not having an impact. The amount of shad that the netters are taking out of the river is very small compared to the size of the population. It's a healthy fishery, it's a sustainable fishery, and nobody should have any guilt about enjoying a shad dinner. Yes?
Actually, I got about 3. Why do you think people aren't shad fishing?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
The state of Connecticut put a $100 thing on their ticket.
Fees.
200.
Yeah.
You know, we fished for $1 a piece, right?
$10 to register the net.
Now, what's that telling you about kids coming up?
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, you've done no search back to 1975. I mean, you're saying how many thousand fish came over. When we fished, there had to have been 3 times that many fish coming up. Because we would catch a ton of fish a night. So, yeah, I know you don't have the,
We don't have data, I can't comment on it, you
but
know.
that's when they were tagging,
Right,
too.
yeah.
Back in 1967, 68,
66 they started it.
yeah,
We got a bucket piece for them.
yeah.
It's a
And
different
they had the
word.
sonar tags on, too.
Can we take a few questions? I don't know.
Sure, let's take 4 questions and then we're gonna turn it over to the gentleman.
Yes.
And then you can ask him more questions at the end.
Yeah, I'm sticking around, so if whatever questions we don't get to, I'll try to answer later on. Yes, ma'am.
Why is the emphasis on building these elaborate fish elevators when in some areas the move is to remove the dams?
Oh, absolutely, and I'm the guy removing the dams. I mean, I was a party of removing 6 dams last year in the state of Connecticut, and I'm about to remove a couple more this year. So I absolutely agree with you on that. However, what we're removing it's voluntary. I mean, we're not going in with guns, putting the guns to the head of the dam owners and say, you have to remove your dam. It's voluntary. Holyoke Gas and Electric, First Light, they're making millions and millions and millions of dollars generating electricity off of these hydroelectric dams on the main stem Connecticut River. They don't want to remove their dams. So, and you know, there's flood control dams, and then there's MDC water supply dams, so we can't remove all the dams. Some of the dams have to remain because they're valued, and for those we need to build fishways. But the others, that's exactly what I do. When I go into a community and talk to a dam owner that says, your dam is blocking migratory fish runs, the first thing I ask is, will you let us remove your dam? And sometimes they say yes, and it's full speed ahead. And we've removed probably 15 or 16 recently in recent years in Connecticut, and we got more waiting in the line. You know, if they say no, then we have to fall back on fishways. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, what other fish are common in the Connecticut River? That, you know, if you go fishing on any given day?
The Connecticut River has more species of fish in it than any other body of water in New England. So there's probably about 150 species in there. But you asked about common species. Not all of them are common.
Right.
But the common ones certainly are, besides forgetting about the migratory fish right now, just the ones that live in here all the time.
Right.
We have largemouth bass and smallmouth bass, and we have 3 species of catfish. We have a bunch of minnows, including one of the ones I like that nobody ever thinks of minnows, but they're one of the most numerous species of spot-tailed shiners. They're a big shiner that's in those creeks now spawning, or they're not spawning, but they're following the fish that are spawning, if you know what I mean. And we've carp, and we've got almost every species of sunfish, and we have white suckers, we have perch, a little bit of everything. We have occasional trout. Trout don't live in the Connecticut River, but if they come out of one of the tributaries that are stocked or something, they'll spend a little time. Once it gets warm, they'll come back up into the tributaries. Another good reason to get rid of these dams or build fishways, because if a trout comes over a dam and gets in the Connecticut River, once July comes, it's not going to survive in the Connecticut River. It needs to go back up. But if there's a dam there, it can't go back up.
Thank you.
Yes?
What was the reason for the precipitous drop-off in the population of fish?
Well, we're still trying to decide that, and while shad have started to recover, some of the other fish, and especially alewives and blueback herring, have not recovered. One theory was it coincided with the resurgence of striped bass, and we know striped bass eat shad, we know that they eat river herring, and I have no doubt that they ate more than their fair share. But I don't really prescribe to that theory wholeheartedly, because those species co-evolved with each other, and a predator normally doesn't eat itself out of house and home. I am more concerned about the bycatch issue. There is a fishery off the coast for Atlantic herring. Now, Atlantic herring is a marine species. It's not anadromous. It doesn't come into our streams. It's closely related to the shad and the river herring. The Atlantic herring population in the North Atlantic is fairly healthy. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to fish for and sell Atlantic herring. Fine. The problem is that when our fish, the American shad, the alewife, and the blueback herring go out to sea, especially as subadults, juveniles, they hang out with the Atlantic herring. And so when they bring these big nets and these paired midwater trawlers in, and they have these huge nets, they're scooping up everything, and they all look the same. And so it's very hard to distinguish, and it's very hard to get data. But we're starting to study this more. We're doing some genetic studies that we can actually go out to a ship in the ocean and take samples, and we can tell you what river that shad or river heron came from. And so we're starting to learn more about the distribution of the fish out there. And I believe that we need to pay a little bit more attention to this bycatch fishery. Because I can tell you, whether you agree with that point of view that I just shared or not, it is marine, that is ocean, in origin. There's nothing wrong with our freshwaters, and it's happening everywhere. It's not just the Connecticut River. That decline I showed happened in every East Coast stream in North America, well, at least in the US. I won't necessarily say what happened in Canada. And so it's something that all of those things had in common, and that's the ocean. So we need to look out there and look a little more carefully, because I think we're doing a pretty good job of managing things in our freshwater. One more, yes?
One more.
Why are they allowed to fish only at night?
They actually are not. They can fish during the day, but they realize that it's better. Here's the story. For a long time, we allowed fishing only with cotton nets, braided cotton nets, not mono. Are you following me? The monofilament is the clear, thin type of netting. The braided cotton is thicker and easier to see. For many, many years, traditionally, you could only fish with the braided net. And the fishermen believed that unless the river was in flood and it was really muddy, that the shad could see the net and they would avoid it. And their effectiveness was much better at night. So that's what happened. Now, a number of years ago, we allowed for the fishing of mono nets. And I'll be very interested in what these guys are going to tell us, because I think some people still don't fish the mono. They still may fish the braided nets, or maybe for reasons, maybe they hold another job or whatever. Some people still fish for at night, but there's nothing to say that you can't fish during the day. Thank you. I'll be around for other questions.
I'm going to turn the program over to Jack Calhoun, who's a member of our board of directors, lifelong resident of Haddam, shad fisherman, and he's going to be sort of our MC for our wonderful panel of current shad fishermen as well as past shad fishermen. So, Mr. Calhoun.
Thank you, Steve. Hey, by the way, that Turner's Falls, I've gone up there and watched the fish show. That's open to the public, at least it was 15 years ago.
Yep.
If anybody wants to go up. I'm just going to introduce the panel. It's Jeremiah Lundgren here, better known as JB. That's his boat out front. Dale DeCarly from Hingham, the good doctor, and thank him for saving the Maynard Shad Shack and starting the museum. Thank you very much, Doctor. Dick Williams, longtime fisherman. Rob Nettleton and, excuse me, that's him, and Freddie Harkey. Anyways, I fished an awful lot of kids and somebody tonight when they saw me said, most of you guys bought your first used car when you turned 16 with your shad money. There's a lot of truth to that. And like when I was fishing, I started when I was 15 and through 17. And we'd fish with gill drift nets at night and then go to school in the morning, and my wife could attest that once in a while she saw me in there with shad scales on my hands and so forth. But anyways, who wants to start? JB is a current fisherman. I just want to start him. That's his boat out here. Just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing this year.
Well, fourth generation to the town of Hingham. I moved back, I guess, about 10 years ago now. And just like the shad, I guess the smell of the scales and the slime got me back into it. And the smell in the oven after hours of cooking it. And now that my wife and my children will also enjoy a great shad dinner now as well, and also smell it for days afterwards. But the fishing this year has been pretty tough. It's been a very slow season. We had a very small warm-up early in the year, and then it got cold again. So it's been a pretty difficult year. If I had to be a professional shad fisherman, I'd probably be very broke. I'm glad that I do have a full-time job to support everybody. It's definitely something that's a very dying tradition, but something that's been in my blood for years. And hopefully, eventually, there's a little guy back there who's 9, who could maybe eventually be a 5th generation to this fishery. But it definitely is something that's a dying tradition. It's a fish that's lost its, I guess, flavor through the years as people have probably traveled, and boats have traveled out more recreationally, farther out into the ocean as we've got more of a sampling of other seafood and fish in the marketplace today. Whereas, you know, a lot of these folks were really accustomed to growing up on shad and shad roe and those type of fish that were really local to the environment, and we have much better access to other seafood today, and I think, unfortunately, has probably hurt the fishery itself as far as from a commercial standpoint. I can say that gill netting is probably somewhat of the most inhumane type of fishing, although from the fishery standpoint, there's still plenty of fish, but it's just it's a kind of a dying tradition, unfortunately, that I'd like to try to keep alive here. And you know, the people that fish every year kind of have been dwindling off. I think there's 5 to 7 people now that actually fish the river. And back when these guys fished, there was, you know, 15 guys that fished in this one stretch of Haddam. And you know, I'm just really happy to be a part of this tonight, and thank you very much, Jack, for being a part of it.
One of the few people around in Haddam that can bonefish, and it's a dying art. If you look at the old photos, most of it is gals in the shed shack that we all know down here in Haddam, and that's a dying breed. And JB learned how.
Captain Frank Russo on the internet. If you can bone an American shad, you can bone anything that swims.
Carly is probably the next youngest fisherman. We're kind of going down the line here.
I started fishing in the middle, I'd say 95 to about 2001. I started fishing because I lived on the river and I had a boat. So I thought, hey, that would be a good thing to do, is go shad fishing. I picked a reach right by the power plant from the other side of Haddam Island, down beyond the power plant, until I ran into a gentleman from East Haddam who decided that was his reach. So I started learning early that you did not go into someone else's reach. So I moved up the river a little bit more. We did quite well, except the first net that I bought was one that belonged on the bottom of the river and floated from the bottom of the river about 10 feet high. And I guess it was kind of a surprise for me when I put the net in and it sunk. So after I lost that net, I got the right kind of net and we started over. And I got my son involved, my father, my wife, and we had a good time. We went out at night because I didn't have to go to work till 10 o'clock in the morning, so I get home at midnight and we'd fish till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And we did quite well, and I ended up moving up to Dublin Hill, and Dick Wattrell was kind enough to loan me some space. I think I saw him here.
He's here somewhere.
And
One-time fisherman, Dick Wattrell back there.
I kept my boat off of his land up by Haddam Cove, and we fished that reach for a couple of years. And then Carol Spencer, who owned the Shad Shack, went out of business, and everybody wanted bone shad, because I used to sell her whole fish. And once that happened, I was pretty much done. I knew how to bone shad, but I didn't have enough time in my life to bone out a shad. So that was about it for me. But it was enjoyable. I enjoyed being on the river at night. I mean, I couldn't navigate on the river during the day because I didn't know where it was. But it was nice to hear the whippoorwills at night, and the rain, and the thunder, and the wind. And that's about all I got.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
I'll tell you my shad story.
I opened my dental practice in 1970, and all the young guys who shad fished were my patients. And Matt Shad here,
Hold up close, Joe.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Matt Shad here. Anyway, Matt Shad was my patient. He was from town. He invited me to go out on the boat. My office is in Haddam. My home is in Haddam. And so anyways, we drove down to his boat, which is down the river, and we went fishing. I liked it a lot. As soon as we get in the boat, Matt opened the sideboard of his Brockway and had a nice liquor cabinet. Finally, after fishing, they let me go and caught some fish. They let me off my house and the bank and have that. I never know how I got home. I really love it. My other story, I'll tell you one more story, but I'm talking too much. I had a friend, patient, everybody knows, he's not alive now, Dave Silk. And one of the better fishermen, Tony Driscoll, made him a net. And he and his wife put the net in their boat, and they drifted down to towards the swing bridge. And that's going down, obviously gets hung up, and they can't release the hang. It's pulling the boat down, and scared the hell. They finally released it, but it scared the hell out of his wife. She would never go fishing with again. So we fished for many years together. And had a good time. But what we did in those days, we would take our fish and we'd take them over to Doc Driscoll. His father named Lefty Driscoll. And Lefty was a great fish boner. He taught a lot of people in town how to bone shad. And we'd give Lefty the pile of fish, and he'd clean them and bone them. We'd give him that stray of fishing roll for $1 a fish. That was great. And he died. Now we have to eat the bone.
I started fishing when I got married, but let me tell you a little bit before that. In England, my father fished with Norman Mooney, and there was Chappells and Nozzles and a bunch of other fellows that fished at that time. And then I used to fish with, I would go out with Frank Bucker's father when he'd take me out. And then when I was in trade school and going with my wife before we got married, her father wanted some shad corks, so I made some from him in trade school in Vinyl Tech. And then we got married, and I started fishing a couple of years after that. We built our own boat, got our own number, built our own boat, and then we started fishing in the Haddam Reach, which is from Eddy Rock to Red Light below the East Haddam Bridge. And we'd start up there, and then put our net in and go down between the Sand Island pier and the go all the way down and start taking that off of Ship's Stern, which is off of Gillette's Castle, and finish taking that by the time we got down into Chester Creek. If you got any further lower than that, you lost your net down in the junk. Well, during the Second World War, when my father fished, the Hazenhurst Foundation, which is the big red barn down there in Haddam, he had the and stuff, but he had Mr. Hazen had a net, a set net, that we used to put, my father would put in the river about this time of the year, when the water was warm enough to walk around in. And then we'd drive the fish into the set net, and then I'd give the fish to all the people in town and the people that worked at Hazenhurst Farm. And it was a good time there. The people didn't have to use their red tags for this. We could buy sugar instead of something during the Second World War instead of buying the fish. And but it was interesting because every set in the Haddam Reach is a different set. And there was about 20 sets at the time, but when I fished there was only about 6 or 8 of us guys fishing down there at the time. So it was easy fishing because you could go where you wanted to go. And after your first drift, when everybody would set off at sunset, you'd come back up to where, what we call the wharf at the time, which is the Middletown Yacht Club now. And then we'd take turns setting after that. And Haddam is a long town, so there is 4 reaches in the town of Haddam. The end of the Middletown Reach and the beginning of the Haddam Reach, and there's 3 in between. And you can fight over the East Haddam Salmon River Reach. Like the gentleman up there said. Yeah. You find out a few things the hard way. My father-in-law fished all his life. He could mend that like crazy. And he always used to tell stories when we were fishing about having the saber fish come up the river. That's what we call the guys that fished them down there. And they'd have shad, they'd have oar fights in the boats for the bird, because the birds would all be filled up. You know, you have 20 guys in a berth, different berths up and down the river there. And then they'd come up and want to have a berth, so they'd have shad fights. They always had big guys, he said, but sometimes you're one and sometimes you're the us. It was always interesting talking to him about different fishing things that they did back in the old days. And every set was different. They put your net in different every time, so you could miss the piers and all the rest of the stuff that floated around. And like I said, we fished up here, and I didn't really fish in the river up here. My father fished for years with Norm Murray, and then I came along, and well, they had a hall, 2 Holland sands below the Red Star Dock, which Sheriff Thompson shot with the state, on the state park down there. And Hughie ran 1 Holland sand out there, and they had the same kind of boat that was shown in the movies there, and then they winch come in with it. They keep one end on the tied to the shore, and then they go all the way across the river and come back again, and they winch in the net and throw the fish in boxes and stuff, and the garbage fish they used to send up to Portland, because there was a fish out cannery up in Portland under the Portland Bridge.
Hold it up close, Stitch.
Yeah,
You gotta hold it up real close.
oh,
There you go.
there was a cannon factory in Portland where they sent all the junk shad and the junk fish, but the shad they sent to Fulton's Fish Market in New York. And that's where Hughie sent a lot of his fish. He didn't bone them all, he'd send them to Fulton's Fish Market. And that's about the general thing that I did. I stopped fishing in 1968. My partner dropped dead on the dock.
That's a good reason.
That was the end of my fishing career.
By the way, Sheriff Thompson's shack was right where the boat launch is in Haddam Meadows.
Yeah,
He's
that's
a
right.
longtime sheriff at the Haddam jail during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and we had a shack down there, which probably was a pretty good time.
That was there.
During Prohibition. No one.
That was there when I was about 18, you know, 19 years old. The state finally tore it down. Okay, very good.
I'm gonna pass this on to Rob. Jack, help me set that thing up, and I'm gonna try and draw up a little bit about the reach and stuff like that, so Rob can talk a little bit first.
Thanks, Fred.
I'm sure you said that.
I got one question for this gentleman over here. Why did they stop the channel cats in the Connecticut River? I'm sorry, why did they stop the channel cats in the Connecticut River?
Stock?
They implanted them in.
Yes.
Because they were not native.
That's right.
Back in the 50s.
And so you're asking why we did that?
And I know at that time there, the river was very dirty. Sewerage would be dumped into the rivers because they're a bottom feeder. Did they stop those because channel cats are bottom feeders, so to speak?
No, that was not the reason. The reason is plain and simple, and that is that there are anglers who just want everything. They would stock tuna in the Connecticut River if they thought they would take. What fisheries management back in the late 1800s and early 1900s was basically just taking fish from one place and dumping them into the other. And it's one of the reasons we cause so much problems. Frankly, most of the fish in the Connecticut River are not native. Largemouth bass are not native. Smallmouth bass are not native. Catfish. When I was a kid, all you caught in the Connecticut River, well, not all you caught, but most of what you caught for catfish were bullheads, brown bullheads.
Yeah.
And then, starting into the 60s and 70s, you started seeing the white catfish come on, and they were also non-native. And then it wasn't until really the 1980s in which you started seeing the channel catch, who had been there all along. The channel cats came in the 20s, but it wasn't until the 80s that they really took hold and you started seeing a lot of them.
But they would go into our nets and eat the shad.
Oh yeah, absolutely, along with the eels. Well, the problem with the catfish in your nets is they've got those spines and they get all tangled in your nets.
Yes. Okay. I fished for 14 or 15 years total. And I started out when I was 14. And I started out with Carl Chappell and his son Jimmy. I fished a year with Jack. I fished a year with Joey Jolson, Dennis Elkins. I'm missing somebody here. I fished a year with Ant. I fished a year with Anthony Driscoll, who was a cripple at that time from polio. And then I went into service, and 3 years later I got out. I fished with Anthony. Then I hooked up with Freddie Harkey. We fished for 5 years. Then he quit on me. And I fished with his brother, like what somebody was saying over there. Sometimes your job, it's time consuming, and the best drift of the night is the daylight drift. When the sun is coming up and you're pulling the fish out of the net and the sun's beating on them, the daylight drift is the best. But back then, a lot of times I was in construction, I was laid off at that time of the year, but Freddie had to work. So it was tougher on him than it was on me.
I was tougher on my wife.
But then I fished with Tommy Harkey for a year, and then I fished 4 or 5 years after that by myself, just one man in the boat. But getting back to, you were talking about a hang in a river or something. The first thing we would do, usually shad fishing opens up around the 1st of April, and they never really hit. We never really went much before the 21st of April up in the Higginham Reach. But before we put the net in, we would always take an old net and drift down through there to pull out the hangs. The hangs can do a number, like a dead tree that dropped. Me and Freddie picked up an old anchor that was probably 4 feet high and weighed 200 pounds, so it came off a big boat. But we always did that first thing in the spring. And the next problem we had was when the Coast Guard put the buoys in. So what we came up with, and this started out with the first guy I ever fished with, Carl Chappell, we would jump the buoy. Especially
Picking the whole net up.
Yeah, pick the net up.
Getting up to the buoy while the tide is running fast and trying to jump it over.
Wow.
It was fun.
One guy would be
You had to be right.
One guy would be on the oars, and the other guy would be in front of the boat, and the guy on the oars had to position me if I was in the front of the boat. And
Yeah, because you were never on the oars.
That's
the easy part, Fred.
I was the net guy. Fred was the captain of the boat. He ran the motor, I took care of the net. But that was pretty valuable, otherwise you had to pick up maybe 100 feet of net to go around the buoy and then let it back out again. So, but 14 or 15 years, you know, and I don't regret one bit of it.
Except your back.
Talking about long hours, I can remember Rob sleeping, I was doing something down, we're out where the dock is, in Haddam is where they just fixed the, down and back of the mill there, what's the name of the mill? Prismarks. The dock road, there used to be just a public right-of-way down there, and we often fish out of there, 2 or 3 nets might be out of there. And
You can't get a word in.
I'm down there in the evening, we're putting our net back in the boat, and look over, there's Mr. Nettleton, he's in a shad box, the little shad box back there. His head's out of one side, his feet's out of the other, and he sounds asleep.
Was he sober?
Now I forgot what I was going to say. If I think of it, I'll wonder back.
Interrupt.
Okay, my name is Fred Harkey, and I come from the Harkeys and the Nozzles as far as shad fishing goes. My father started, what I can remember when I was very small. He was not a shad fisherman at first, but he did herring, alewives, okay? And they used to haul herring down, we called it Big Ditch, which was up from the power plant, the place in there. Rock Landing is about here. And they would haul for herring, buckies, I don't know. Maybe they were back, I'm not sure what kind they were. But anyways, that started off my thing with fishing. They would come up with, not the Brockway boat, they had pointed end boats, and I can remember seeing them, and the dock has some pictures there. They're filled with herring right to the gullet. I mean, just, you couldn't get another one in without sinking the boat. And that only lasted for a while, and then the market fell out. I think they went to Portland, like you were saying, to junk fish. And I remember one time they took up a whole dump truck full. The guy wouldn't take it anymore, so they buried him somewhere. I won't tell you where it is. No, they didn't go in the river, they buried him. But anyway, that was my start. And my family, there was George, myself, George is my uncle, myself, his kids, and 2 kids that fished for him and stuff. We used to fish up at the Maroma Sleep. This is where the Pratt thing is, and we fished from there down by Bird Park. That was before I was 20 years old. I used to go with my uncle. And then I got tangled up with, I guess, I don't think I fished anybody besides Rob. But we started fishing the Haddam Reach, which was down through here, and we picked up before Haddam Island. So it went from, say, Haddam Creek, just about to Haddam Island, somewhere in that area. And sometimes we got right down to Haddam Island. There was a lot of fish and fast water and a lot of shit in the water. That was a big thing early. Sticks and garbage and everything else that was in the water. When you picked the net up, you wanted to put it back out again. So every time you're picking it up, you want to get the sticks out. You want to get everything out of that net. So when it goes back out again, it's got to go out clean. Otherwise, you got a whole mess going out in the river. Like I said, we fished for that many years here. I'm trying to think of some of the other things that was going on. Oh, earlier, the hauling thing for shad. My uncles did that, the nozzle side. They fished for Maynard out of the Haddam Meadows, and they had a hauling seine that went out here down by Mill Creek. And they fished that for many years during the war, I think that was.
There was 2 of them.
Yeah, and my uncle told me at one time, they got like 50 boxes of shad out of that one haul, which was 100 and some pounds a box. So that's a lot of fish. And they would, during the war, that's all they had was get the fish in, you know. But our fishing with me and Rob and I, We sold most of them to Hubie. Of course, we gave a lot away to people that wanted some. We didn't really care if there's some neighbors that came around and stuff like that. Of course, they'd give us a half pint or a case of beer or something like that. I shouldn't tell Rose that, right?
I'm gonna tell her.
But most of our fish went to Hubie. We did, I don't know if I shipped with you or not to New York. I did with my uncle, George. My uncle George used to call him the little fella. He was short. But there's two stories to that, because a half pint of whiskey is also called a little fella. Or a flatfish. And I'm not quite sure what they meant when they called him a little fella, because he did like a half pint. Oh God, what else can I tell you about fishing? Except my back right now. That was probably the biggest thing, it's taking a toll on your back. I mean, when you picked up a box of fish out of the boat, you had to bring them up to the truck. It was 120 pounds, I don't know. And of course, it always seems like I picked it up. But I figured that out. But he was shorter than I, so when we're picking it up, I had to wait. I don't know. There were questions.
How about the hull of the boat with those big gold spikes? The hull of the boat, you guys.
Rob was talking about that, that anchor we picked up. I think around that same time, we found a piece of boat. It was off of Herd Park in that area. I think that's what got the anchor to it, wasn't it?
It was down, going over where the gazebo was.
Okay, so this is different. We got this piece of boat, and it was a bunch of ribs and some sideboards. And it was, I don't know, could have been probably 5-10 feet long, something like that. But we took it apart, and I got all these brass nails out, and they were forged brass nails. And I've been to a lot of museums. I've been over to Long Island, to Sag Harbor. I've been out to a lot of different places, and nobody has ever heard of these. They're about 6-7 inches long, and they're forged brass. And they were in that planking of the boat. I think I pulled out about 14 or 15 of them, and that was about all there was. Had no clue where they came from, and nobody has an answer. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not familiar at all with this netting and how that works. And how you one boat, how do you put it out, and how large is it? And
okay. When we fish, like JV's fishing with a short net, it's only like 350. We used to fish with 800 feet. When you pull it into the boat, or set it up into the boat, you have rings on one side and corks on the other side, and you pull it over the bow.
Okay.
And as you let it out the same way. The first ring, the first cork, you kind of spread them as you throw them out. And then all the way through to the end.
And how do the rings and the corks get there? Tell her.
How the rings and corks get there.
Well, that's your wife that asked that question. I don't.
You have to string the net with the cork.
Oh,
You have to make the net.
This is after a net's made. Oh, you want to know before the net's made?
These are the rings that he's talking about.
Yeah.
But you were, at this point, you were stationary. You were going forward or going back?
No, okay, we go to it close to a shore, not too short.
Okay.
And we drop out a buoy on the cork line, which would be a light, and a ring. And as we back away from the shoreline, we start letting the net out, all the way across the river. And we try to make a hook in it as much as we can, because the eddies on the river and the currents will change how the net goes out. And we get to a certain point, now the net's all the way across, and hopefully doing good, with no hangs on the bottom that's hooked it up. So then we start picking it. We pick from the side we picked out, and we hook it a little bit more. So as we're picking the ring line, which is the bottom line, into the boat first, we're making a pocket. The cork line comes in later. So if any fish are loose, they'll drop into it. They can get loose. In other words, they get gills so much, but pretty soon they might drop off. And we keep picking all the way across, and that's basically how it works. Then you pick it up, get the fish out. The fish come out every time we pick it up. We don't leave the fish in the net. So we take them out, throw them in the back in a box or tub or something.
Explain why you use rings and not lead sinkers.
Well, leads were used a long time ago, but when you get hung on the bottom with a lead line, and that's usually a piece of rope, what do? You gotta pull it up from both ends and cut it. This way here, the ring line is made with, you'll see it out there in the net. It's a small thread. You can grab it and rip it. So you only pull a piece of the net out instead of having to cut that big line off. It's easier.
The rope was so strong, your net with the water going would just fold around and you'd have a net that's a mess.
Yeah.
So then with the rings, it rips right out and you keep going.
If there was nothing there that you could actually lift up off the bottom, you just had to cut that rope line and it didn't work.
You're putting out 800 feet of net. How'd you get along with the tugs and barges?
Very carefully. It was very hard because we were probably, when we started fishing, it's like Dick Wattrell fished and Dick Williams and I don't know, some of the other guys here. They would come up quite often, and sometimes you'd be just about done getting out of the way of one of them, set it back out, and there'd be another one coming. We had no way of knowing. They were on no schedule, and they were not too gracious, let's put it that way.
It's built a swell, pull away from you like that.
No, we didn't worry about that. In fact, one day my brother was fishing, and I think we were fishing together at that time too, and he was up off a reach up there, and the tanker came up, and my brother just could not get the net out of the way in time. He had to cut his net and pull away. He cut his net right in half and got the hook out of the way. I mean, there was some choice words.
Barges can't stop.
No more barges.
Did you have to take the tide into consideration?
We tried to fish a tide that was basically outgoing, and then to what we call backup water. Because at that backup water, you'd stop your movement downriver, and you could sit there for quite a while and catch fish. But then, through the graces of the state of Connecticut, they put the catfish in, and the catfish would get into our nets and raise holy hell, because at one time we got over 100 catfish one night, and we just kept throwing them into the boat, getting them out of there, throwing them in the boat so they didn't tangle up the net. We looked back, and we used to use rubber tires for floats to put our light on. Both of them were flat from their prongs, side of the boat, side of the things. But yeah, we tried to fish the tide, you know.
What did you do with the junk fish that you sent to, wherever you sent them to Portland, wherever they went? What did they do with the junk fish?
I don't know. I never had any junk fish fishing.
I can answer some of that. A lot of what we were talking about, the alewives and the buckies, that fishery goes way back, back in the 1700s, and they would actually net those. The shad were kept for local consumption because you could make money off of it. Those they would put in barrels and salt them, and then send them to the Caribbean, and it was part of the slave molasses triangle. Slave molasses and salted fish from New England. And they would first feed the slaves down in the sugarcane plantations, and the molasses would come up here. And it's why New England was distilling more rum than they were in the Caribbean, because the molasses would come up here, and New Englanders would make rum out of it. But that fishery continued right into the 60s. The last people that I know that did that, the bucky fishing, were at Wethersfield. And this is a historical society. If any of you knew Eleanor Wolfe of the Wethersfield Historical Society, there's some glass slides they've got of the last river herring fishery up there. But people were doing it right through the war, and it has slowly died out. But interestingly, if you meet some families, some people from the Caribbean, people whose ancestors probably worked as both workers and previously as slaves, salted fish is still an important part of their diet because it was just ingrained in them because so many people ate these salted herring.
One other thing I forgot to tell you too, like this section, we
Hold
call
the
it,
mic up.
this section here we call the Higgin Reach, we'll say. At one time, there was probably 9 nets in there, at least, and there was like 2 or 3 up here. And you go down by Rock Landing, there was a couple more in here. So at one time, you might have had 20 nets fishing out there. And you had to find, you know, you pick up your net, you run back up, try to get another drift in. And sometimes somebody would undercut you. I mean, there was all kinds of things.
What years do you think were the most nets on the river? What do you think was the peak of shad fishing on the Connecticut River?
I think it was right when we started, right, Ron? I can remember 9 at the dock,
No, it was,
Haddam dock.
yeah, I would say,
There was Buckeye,
66, late 60s.
But they
I'd
also
say-
were hauling
I
St.
think early to, 60s, early to late.
That's in the 65, it was 65.
Yeah, probably, yeah. But one more question to you is, knowing that the bluefish and the stripers eat the shad and the herring, why did they put a limit on them?
Well, because they're under their own stresses. So, you know, there's people who don't care about shad, but care just about striped bass and bluefish, and so they're the ones that
Well,
are...
let me tell you a little story. Back in the 50s and 60s, when I used to striper fish down off the Sabre, I'd see nothing more than 1,000, 1,500 stripers coming through in a school. You don't see that now.
Right.
But they moved upriver eating shad, and the bluefish moved upriver eating shad.
Yeah, at least
herring.
As far as Essex.
Yeah? No, further.
Bluefish?
Oh, yeah. Right up to Hamburg's.
Oh, well, yeah, okay, yeah.
I can never figure out why they put a limit on them. Any more? Wait a minute, you should ask me.
Why is not somebody training people to bone shad? I mean, all those shad out there, you're developing the fisheries and all that, and if fewer people are boning them, fewer people are going to eat them. Oh, what's it all for? Why don't you teach shad boning in
I
some
have no
school?
idea, I just taught them.
Billy Huffstetler still bones them.
What's going to happen when nobody bones shad?
It's worse on the West Coast, you know. They took shad from the Hudson River over to the Columbia River. And there's a huge run of American shad in the Columbia River, and nobody knows how to bone them out there, and nobody will eat them because if some New Englander went out and set up a shad shack on the banks of the Columbia River, they'd probably make a lot of money.
I think the problem is, though, is the price hasn't moved since 1978 either, unfortunately. So that's part of the problem with the fish itself, is that it hasn't stayed with the times economically as far as the price of it goes.
One thing I wanted to say was when I started out, first 3 or 4 years, we would ship the fish to Fulton Fish Market in New York. And that wasn't such an easy thing to do because in the afternoon that day, you would have to go to Middletown up on Oak Street from the ice house and buy blocks of ice. Then you take them down to the river, keep them whole, and then when you come back fishing for the night, you would have to chop the ice with an ice chopper, and you would pack fish into the shad box. 28 fish in a shad box. Then you had to ice it down, You had to nail a lid on the shad box. Then you had to take that up, and we used to drop the fish off at where the Haddam hardware store is today. They used to have a dock out back there. You remember that, Jack, right? And a trucking firm from Rhode Island would come up and pick them up every day. You know, we weren't the only ones he was doing. He would go along the way and pick up shad and take it to the Fulton Fish Market. So it wasn't just catching fish and taking them down to Hubie Spencer's, you know, so.
And that's when we thought Hubie Spencer wasn't giving us a fair price. We added an alternate, we should.
Yeah, I made one day when we started going to Hubie Spencer, I made a phone call down to Fulton Fish Market. Lockwood and Winnet was the name of there was Ford and there was a couple more that you could ship them to. But I made a call down there to find out the price of the shad was. And I was questioning because I wanted to compare what Hubie was paying us. And Fulton Fish Market was paying more than he was. And we went down that week to pick up our check from Hubie. Hubie says, "Oh, I hear you've been making long distance calls to New York." That's all I got.
Mention about where shad, how much local factories were involved in the netting business, especially East Haddam, where we watch shad net and so forth.
Oh, oh yeah. We used to buy the cotton shad nets over in East Haddam. And I always bought my nets, and everybody that I fished with bought it from Shay's over in East Haddam, right past the Goodspeed Opera House on Creamery Road. There's a big building in there, maybe 1,000 feet in there, and that's where we used to buy all the equipment. But there was one, Brownell, over in Moodus, and I think there was one or two more, and somebody mentioned the other day.
Neptune. Neptune 24.
Now I think it's all made to buy monofilament net. You buy it out of Tennessee, and it's made by the Japanese. So,
the rings were made by J.C. Products, at least the ones we were using.
The rings.
The wire shop.
Yeah, the rings.
Down in Haddam Center that they just tore down as part of building the new bridge down there. And then they'd be galvanized. Mr. Chappell or somebody would take them up to Middletown and have them galvanized at Wilcox Britain factory in Middletown when they were still open.
Okay.
The factory in East Haddam is now a fitness place, and the lady that took it over left all the machinery in there from the fishnet machinery, and they've cleaned it all up. And it's really cool in there.
Which one?
This is the factory that made the nets in East Haddam on Creamery Road.
Used to be the Bullfish, right?
On Creamery Road.
Nice white building, nice wooden white building.
Jack.
The airport.
I just do want to mention that, JB, your wife bones fish, right?
No,
No, who does it for you?
I do everything. I only have somebody help me with, I have to get somebody stupid enough to find to go with me. So
I'm sure you have many people in the audience.
just to literally row, but I pull the net, I take the fish home, I do everything. Like, whereas these guys used to just fish, and obviously the poundage is much different compared to what I catch. But I do everything from start to finish. I scale it, I take the roe out, I bone it, and then I even smoke it too on top of it. So I literally do everything from start to finish. So it's the fish that never ends, as I like to describe it. You do one thing to it, and then you got to do 6 more things to it in order for it to even make it edible. So You know, it's definitely a acquired skill, and for the amount of patience that I have is very little. You would, when you see me sit down with a fish like that, you'd think I was the most patient person in the world. So.
JP, I've never seen you mend a net yet.
You know, that's what I got the retired guys for.
I've got a question here, Rob.
Sure. Why are the shads so much smaller now than they used to be?
Well,
You have to ask.
I'll tell you, and either it was in 1983 or 86, I went out on a trip, I was drip fishing by myself, but my brother said, I'll go with you tonight. He says, because it's windy. Well, I put the net in and I let out all the net that I had, 1,000 feet. And this was up in the rope, right off the ledges in Maromas, up by the breakwater. And wind was blowing, tide was going out. And on that one drift, I caught 1,400 pounds of fish on one drift. And I caught a 12.3 ounce shad on that drift. And if it says 12.3s on Hubie Spencer's scale, you know
it's closer to 13. That fish is at the Elm Street DEP headquarters, correct?
I thought it was at deep.
In Hartford, though.
Yes.
Yes.
Supposedly, Jack says he went up there.
I've been up there a lot, I've never noticed it unexplained.
Okay. But that's where Hubie Spencer called them up, they came down and took the fish. And that's the last I ever saw it. Dougie Netterbetti, who used to do the scaling and cleaning the fish for Hubie, well, he passed away, so I can't use him for a record.
And that couple of years right there, even when I was fishing with Rob, we caught a lot of fish that were in the 9, 10 pound class.
Yes.
Easy.
Yes.
Very easy.
What made you say that you thought the fish were small? They don't appear to be small to me.
I used to shad fish back in the early 50s. And we averaged about, I think about 5 or 6 pound fish. Now you go to a fish market, and they say that the ones they're getting now are only about 3 pounds. They're only a little, you get a little bit in the leg, about a third of what we used to get.
The average fillet today, I would say, is anywhere between 3/4 of a pound to a pound, is probably what the average bone fillet is. It's a small, you know, it's, I don't know, maybe, Steve, you have some.
Years ago, when we fished in the late 50s, we used to catch a lot of bucks. But JP, how many bucks did you catch this year?
I've only had 5 bucks, and what Uncle Rob's referring to is a male shad, as opposed to the roe.
So the bucks are
5, that's it, out of approximately 120 fish.
They used to have so many days you use it for fertilizer.
Yeah.
So many bucks.
some days, we used to throw the bucks overboard because they were paying a penny or 2 cents a pound or something. Instead of handling them, taking the Spencers, we throw them overboard.
So, a couple of comments on fish size. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that the average fish is getting any smaller, but I do think there's evidence to suggest we're missing the older fish. We're missing the fish that used to come back 3 or 4 times to spawn. So if you imagine a bell curve, that the upper part is not as common, and that could be for 2 reasons. One, and we're sort of addressing this, a lot of the shad can get up over the dams and spawn, but at certain dams they're having a hard time getting back down. And so our repeat spawning rate has gone down. But the other thing is climate change. So remember I told you that below North Carolina they don't repeat spawn, and north of North Carolina they'll spawn again in increasing numbers as you go up because it's water temperature. And so as the Connecticut River gets warmer, and it is getting warmer, that's probably contributing to a lower repeat spawning rate in the Connecticut River. Those two things combined could mean that your 3-year-old fish, bucks or roes, are probably the same size, but you're missing the 6 and 7-year-old fish. So you're missing those big ones. Now, as far as the bucks, and I'm really surprised to hear you say just $5. One of the things that is always, our data bears out, and I'd be interested in your guys' perspective on this, is that often in a run, and a run is the entire season. So the 2016 run is going on now, but you have different waves. They don't all come in at once. They come in through a couple of months. And sometimes the bucks and roes segregate themselves. You know, the oldest ones come in first, the youngest ones come in later, and sometimes you have a run of exclusive bucks, sometimes you have a wave of exclusive bucks, and sometimes exclusive roes. And I'd be interested in your perspective on that, and if you guys have seen that. And then, if that is true, it makes me wonder whether it just happens that you just haven't hit a wave of bucks this year.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't the buck sperm the female eggs? So if there's not a lot of bucks, maybe that's a problem.
Well, so you're right. If in fact what you're saying is true, is that, you know, there's 95 roe and there's 5 bucks, and if that extends up into the spawning grounds, then we've got a problem. Because normally what happens is you have 5 or 6 bucks around one female in the spawning grounds, and they'll be spreading their gametes around, and they all fertilize in the middle so that there's more bucks than females. But what I think would happen is these things are running on their migration when you guys are netting them. They're not spawning. They're spawning basically up in Hartford, Enfield, and up into Massachusetts. So, and they're going to spawn a couple of weeks after you get a crack at them. So if in fact tonight, you see all females, it's not a problem if in 2 nights later you see males. And eventually when they get up to the spawning grounds, they mix in. So that's the key. It's not what you're seeing in one night, it's what you're seeing throughout the season. And sometimes you may go out and, you know, when the bucks are running, maybe it's raining and there's a bunch of sticks in the river and you go, I'm not going out tonight. So, you know, you have to sort of sit back and take the big picture before you can conclude what's going on.
Do you think that this year there was no freshet? Was there an early run?
Absolutely. And I think you guys
could have gone by.
What you guys said was right, because we saw the exact same thing with the alewives down at Bride's Brook, that we had an incredibly early start this year for 2 reasons. Because of the mild winter, Long Island Sound never got as cold as it normally does. And so we had alewives running through Rocky Neck and Bride's Brook in the end of February.
Oh, wow.
That's wild. Then we got that cold weather and everything slowed down and it just pulled the rug out from under it. And so you're right, it's very possible that a bunch of fish, so what happens in the migration is the fish often struggle. It may take them a couple of weeks to get from Old Saybrook to Middletown because they're fighting this incredibly cold water that's snowmelt from Vermont. They didn't have that this year. The river was incredibly low and it was warm, and they were able to get in sooner. And so you guys don't even start putting nets out until the beginning of April. You could have had fish in here in March.
Now, the one thing that we do experience too now, and that some of the older guys have, is what we get is called gizzard shad, which are actually a native to the Gulf of Mexico, correct, Steve?
Actually, southern East Coast.
So, and I don't know, maybe you have any type of information on how are those fish, they seem to kind of just hop on the train and hop on with the rest of the shad, it seems to be.
When early in my career, they weren't around at all. Every once in a while, a guy would pick them up, and there was a shad netter, and I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was from up here or down below, but they called them Geechee River shad.
Or mud shad, they call them down south.
Exactly, and there is a Geechee River in Georgia, and they're really common there. And what we're seeing with the gizzard shad, the same with hickory shad, is it's a natural range extension, and again, it's climate change. And so what we're seeing throughout the East Coast is we're losing our cold water species like salmon, although that's a special case because it was a restoration, but salmon, tomcod, smelt, all these fish that were, the Connecticut River was full of smelt back in the 60s. They're all gone now, they've retreated north, and now we're getting these species from the mid-Atlantic, like black sea bass, and hickory shad, and gizzard shad, and they're moving north. So it's, you know, we have enough trouble putting catfish in our river, but now Mother Nature is bringing new species in as well.
I had two questions. One of them was, when I worked at the power plant in Carnegie, we had a fish basket out there.
Yes.
And we pulled in, we would find flatfish in there, very small flat. What were they?
Hog chokers.
Are they normal to the river?
Yes, they are. I'm going to be very brief on this because I could spend a half an hour. This is a fascinating fish. It's a freshwater, that's about as big as they get. It's a freshwater flounder. When they're really young, they go all the way up to Hartford and then come back down in the fall. And then the next year, they go up to Middletown and then they come back down. And then the next year, they come to Higginham and they go back down. And then finally, when they're about 5 or 6 years old, they don't go up at all. They stay in the estuary. If any of you keep native fish in an aquarium, they make a great aquarium fish. But they're ugly as hell, and I don't know why they call them hog chokers. Someone probably fed them to their pigs and they choked them.
And one other thing I've never seen before, I live on the river, and I've been there for 70 years, just about off and on. These sturgeon reaching, they call them a white sturgeon?
We've got two species. This is, again, I'm going to have to be brief because we can talk all night about sturgeon. This is really interesting. And you guys, in all of your time, you must have rolled a few sturgeon in your day. They're very hardy. They're both on the federal endangered species list. If these guys took them home, they could be arrested. But the nice thing about sturgeon is they don't normally gill themselves. You unroll them and they just swim away. So we have two species. The short-nosed sturgeon that only gets about 4 feet long. And then the Atlantic sturgeon, which we thought was extirpated, but now we're starting to find young ones in the river again. They get up to 12 feet long. Some of you may have seen a picture of a short-nosed sturgeon on the tailgate of my truck with me and my supervisor. The River Quest had called this thing in. It was down in Lyme, and it was dead. It was 7 feet long. And it took both of us to lift it up and put it on the tailgate. Somehow that got on the Weather Channel and went nationwide. But that's, so we have these sturgeon, and lately, just in the last few years, I personally have been seeing more sturgeon. I've been in my boat. Yeah, small ones, but I'll be going along and they're breaching. They just come right out of the water right next to your boat and slap down. It's very exciting.
I've never seen that
since
the last
There was a 9-foot one that jumped up on a sailboat last year in Essex Island Marina.
Right.
Actually, yeah, because early in the striper season as well, after the shad are done, I typically would like to go striper fishing. And last year, the amount of sturgeon that jumped out of the water early in the morning last year down at Essex Island Marina, you couldn't believe it.
And in the Brockway Reach, I saw 2 in the Brockway Reach at the same time, one over here and one over there.
Yeah.
And then there's
We caught one back in the early 50s. It was 528 pounds. And 128 pounds of roe.
Black caviar.
In fact, go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
We thought when it coming up the net, we thought we had a lob. It came up, and all of a sudden we saw it was a fish. So we couldn't get it in the boat. So we had to pull the rest of the net in and take it into the dock and get it out of the net. And we put a rope through the gills and tied it to the dock. And the next day, we used to sell our shed. A guy used to come with a trailer truck and pick them up in the morning. And he couldn't take it down. He had to make arrangements for Fulton fish market to take it. And it took, I think, about 4 days for them to make the arrangements. So about 4 days later, they came, we had an awful job. I think it took 5 or 6 of us to get it out of the water and into his truck and get it iced down. And,
the little known
that made our year's fishing though.
Yeah, right, I can imagine. A little known fact, in the early 1700s, Connecticut River sturgeon was the largest export back to England. there was a lot of sturgeon being caught out of this river, and it shrunk. These things don't sexually mature until they're 24 years old, so you can overfish them very easily, and they're very sensitive to pollution. So the population shrunk, but the last of the fishery was probably right around World War I, and it was out of Portland and Cromwell. And even now, that area is still sort of the epicenter for sturgeon in the Connecticut River.
Probably because of the old slaughterhouse, I'm guessing. You just have the pipe going right down.
Yeah, well, it also has a lot to do with that deep hole off of Pocket Rock.
And when I was fishing down in Haddam on the Eddie Rock, we saw one come out of the water about 8 or 9 feet. Big one.
That gets your attention.
It does, especially when they're right next to the boat.
I never catching shad with a fish.
That's not what they're talking about.
Shad with a rod and reel?
Yes, absolutely. And I had one slide up there that I sort of skimmed over. Shad fishing on rod and reel was never known until they developed the hatchery at Leesville, and they produced such a huge run that people realized that first it started out with a naked hook. No bait, no nothing. You just throw a naked hook out and you could get them to strike. These fish, like all anadromous fish, they don't feed when they're in fresh water. But you can aggravate them, you can entice them to strike. Later on, they developed what's called the willow leaf, which is a naked hook with a little bit of a blade on it. And then there's the shad dart. Most down here, it was willow leaves. But as the sport fishery really developed off the mouth of the Farmington River in Windsor and the Enfield Dam, and the current is stronger there, and they use these shad darts. But the Connecticut River was really known as the center of sport fishing for American shad, and still is. It used to be at the Enfield Dam. When the Enfield Dam was totally destroyed, it was totally gone. That fishery now moved up to Holyoke, Massachusetts, and they still have shad derby. Windsor still has a shad derby, but they don't catch as many shad anymore. But Holyoke has a big shad derby. Lots of people catch them, and the world record rod and reel shad has come out of the Connecticut River, and it's about 9.5 pounds or something like that. It's a fun sport fishing, because what happens is you get them into the fast water and you've got them on the hook, and they're flat side by side. So when they turn their side to the water current, it's like carrying a piece of plywood on a windy day. You really, they're a lot of fun.
Especially like tackle too.
Yes.
What's the price of roe going? Is roe very expensive now?
Today, roe, if you bought it at a grocery store, you're probably somewhere between $8.99 a pound to $13.99 a pound.
Say city fish.
Yeah, probably $13.99 a pound.
You could probably do better in Tylerville.
I was going to say, if you come to my garage, I sell it for $5 a pair. Hey, that's what I get out of my house.
Where do you sell your smoked shad?
So I actually sell it at my house. So if there's a sign...
I need your address.
And once you have the bones for it, you see that hail.
Yep, $9.99 a pound to $13.99 a pound is pretty much the...
And years ago, you could get it.
$8.99 a pound. I think I saw an article from like 1984.
I've seen it down to 3 cents a pound. It costs 4 cents to ship it to New York.
Getting back to the sturgeon.
I
want this gentleman.
They have a little fish market. They take, we get maybe 100 some fish a night, so they could easily sell that. People were shipping to New York, they were gonna lose money. We had one guy one night, he made one drift, he caught 400 drift in his drift, and he had a set net. He used to set nets off of Essex Meadows, right off the yacht clubs here now. And he had over 200 fish in that set net. But that kind of ruins the theory of them going just in the channel, because that is a quarter of a mile away from the channel, and it's in the flats. The channel is on the other side, on the line side of the river there. And he caught 200 fish there.
But that's where they're milling around. Remember my map that showed them milling around? That's what in Essex, and that area is pretty deep. You're right, the channel's over by Knott Island, but that whole area is fairly deep and they need that whole area when they mill around, so it's a good place to fish.
I never realized, I never saw anybody ever catch a fish around here on a rod and reel. We used to go down the dock and nobody ever catch anything.
No.
But at the Shad Museum, they have some film on catching shad by rod and reel, and they can ride out of the water.
Oh, they're great.
Totally, they're a heck of a fighting fish.
But you're right about not down here. The thing about shad is you gotta fish them where there's an obstruction. Down here, there's no obstruction. They're moving through, and because they're not feeding, you're not going to get in and entice them to strike. At Leesville, they were below the dam and they were constricted. At Enfield, they were below the dam. At the Farmington River, where two streams come together, they're trying to figure out which stream to go up. That's where you angle for shad. You want to get them where they're paused, where they're slowed down. At Holyoke, of course, it's right below the dam.
I have some lures home that I took out of shad we caught that, what I think was some that were coming back down the river. They broke the line. Usually most of them had the hook with little red beads on it.
Yep.
And they broke the line. I had 4 or 5 in the 5 years I fished. I started when I was 8 years old, and I fished until I went to high school. I had too much homework, I had to.
Where'd you fish?
In Brockway's Reach, right in front of our house.
All right, we're gonna wrap this up. Mr. Nettleton has one more thing he's gonna say, because it's almost 9.
You were talking about sturgeons a few minutes ago, and we caught one night that was 7 feet long. So we said, how are we going to ship this to New York? So we knocked out the 2 ends of 2 shad boxes, nailed them together, put the sturgeon in there, but it was too long. We had to bend the tail. We iced it down, and we shipped it to Fulton Fish Market. A week later, I got a bill for $3.50 for shipping. They didn't want it.
Tell them it was a buck. Tell them it was a buck.
It was a buck, it wasn't a female.
Any last questions?
I'm sure our panelists will stay up here. Okay, one more.
Yeah, around here, every once in a while, we find a road, a street that's named Oil Mill Road. What's the deal with the oil?
A lot of it's along the coast, like East Lyme.
What kind of oil is it?
Usually Menhaden.
It's Menhaden, it's fish oil.
Yeah, it's fish oil. They would render it. In fact, Rocky Neck State Park was a fish plant before the state took it over for a plant, and they rendered fish oil. Guilford had a bunch of them. The coastline probably smelled pretty badly back then.
How do those mills work?
You know, they called them mills, and I assume that at some point some of them may have been tide mills or windmills, but most of it, they were just vatting. And I don't know the details of it, but I think they were just putting these fish into boiling vats. They were boiling them, and the oil would come to the surface and they'd skim it off. Hey, I'll make one closing comment. You know, people are saying this is a dying art. Why aren't people training people to bone shad, and why aren't there more fishermen on the river and this dying art? What you should understand is this is hard work. I mean, these guys it's romantic being out on the river, and especially on a beautiful night. Tonight would be a good night, but they were out there, rain and sleet and nastiness, and again, nobody can make their living off of this entirely, so they're working 2 jobs, they're doing all this stuff. This is a great New England tradition. This is one of the oldest traditional fisheries in the United States. The Connecticut River shad fishery has not changed much in a long, long time. But the reason why is because, how many young people do you see out on the river right now? They might be out playing a video game about shad fishing, but they're not out shad fishing. So that's the issue. These guys can tell you. I mean, you heard the stories. They get up. They have to make their nets. They have to mend their nets. Then they have to bone the fish, and then they have to sell the fish, and then they have to make sure that somebody's not screwing them on the price. So it's a lot of hard work, and that's why the fishery is going down. It's not the fish are there. we all have to eat more shad. I think.
And that's only one day. That all starts right back again is when you're done with the last part of it.
Thanks, guys, that was great.
Quickly thank Steve and our panelists, and I'm sure they'll stick around for a few minutes to answer any questions. But again, thank you, gentlemen. JP, I'm hoping maybe we can do a workshop on boning shad.
I did shoot some stuff with the GoPro Hero this year too, of me setting the net. I'm going to give it to Dr. Zions for the Shad Museum and things. So.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you, gentlemen, and Steve, very much for your